On Easter Sunday, the 1st of April 1945, just past noon, two American columns met on a road near the town of Lippstadt, east of the Ruhr. One column had come north from the Rhine bridgehead at Remagen. The other had come south from the crossing sector at Wesel. When they made contact, a ring closed behind them. Inside that ring sat Field Marshal Walther Model and the whole of Army Group B, the last organized German army in the West. 18 days later, the ring held no organized resistance at all. 317,000 German soldiers had surrendered inside it, along with some 24 generals and one admiral. That figure was larger than the German loss at Stalingrad. It was the largest single surrender of German forces anywhere in Western Europe, and it marked the death of organized German resistance on the Rhine. The trap began with a bridge that was never supposed to survive. By the early spring of 1945, the Western Allies had closed up to the Rhine along almost its entire length. The river was the last great natural barrier standing between the American, British and Canadian armies and the German interior. It was wide, fast and deep, and for centuries it had shielded the western provinces of Germany from invasion. Behind it, along the eastern bank, the German command intended to make its final stand in the west. Every bridge was to be dropped the moment Allied troops came near, so that the river could be crossed only by assault boat and pontoon under fire at a cost. On the 7th of March, the 9th Armoured Division of the United States First Army reached the west bank of the Rhine at the town of Remagen, roughly halfway between Bonn and Koblenz. The division had broken through the last belt of the Siegfried Line and pushed toward the river faster than anyone on either side had expected. In front of them stood the Ludendorff railroad bridge, and the bridge was still standing. Every other crossing over the lower Rhine had already been dropped into the water. This one was still up. The Germans had prepared it for the same fate. Charges had been wired along its spans, more than 3 tons of explosive in all, enough to fold the bridge into the river. When American armour appeared on the west bank, the demolition order was given. The main charge failed. Only part of the explosive detonated. The bridge lifted, settled and held. A single stretch of steel and timber across the Rhine had refused to fall. American infantry ran onto the span under machine gun and small arms fire, cut the wires they could reach and pushed to the far bank. By nightfall, a company of American soldiers stood on the east side of the Rhine. For the first time in the war, an Allied army was across the river, inside Germany proper, with a bridge at its back. The water barrier that had shielded the German heartland for centuries had been crossed in a single afternoon by men who had not even been ordered to try. The reaction in Berlin was fury. Hitler saw the loss of an intact Rhine bridge as an unforgivable failure, and he ordered a flying court-martial to find the officers responsible. 4 German officers, 3 majors and a lieutenant were tried and shot for failing to destroy the bridge in time. A 5th was condemned in his absence. The executions changed nothing on the ground. The Americans were already across, and they were pouring men and vehicles over the river hour by hour. The bridge itself did not last. For 10 days, German artillery, aircraft and even combat swimmers tried to bring it down. On the 17th of March it finally collapsed while American engineers were working to reinforce it. The fall cost the lives of 28 of those engineers. But by then the bridge was no longer the point. The First Army had already thrown pontoon crossings across the Rhine beside it, and the bridgehead on the east bank was miles deep and firmly held. The siege at Remagen had advanced the entire Allied timetable for crossing the Rhine by roughly 3 weeks. What lay beyond that bridgehead was the reason it mattered so much. To the north stood the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. The Ruhr produced the bulk of the Reich's coal and the bulk of its steel. Its blast furnaces, its coal pits and its rail yards had fed the German war machine from the first day of the war. Take the Ruhr, and Germany could no longer forge tanks, guns or shells in any quantity. Whoever held the Ruhr held the arsenal of the entire German state. For the Allied High Command, the industrial basin had long been one of the central objectives of the whole campaign in the West. It was the prize that would decide how much longer Germany could keep an army in the field. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American 12th Army Group, understood exactly what the region was worth. He also understood that attacking straight into it would be slow and costly. The Ruhr was a maze of factory districts, canals, slag heaps, and dense cities, ground made for defense. Rather than fight through it street by street, Bradley chose to go around it. He would seal the whole industrial basin off from the rest of Germany and let it wither, cut off from supply and command. The plan was a double envelopment. 2 American armies would drive east on either side of the Ruhr, then swing toward one another behind it. To the north, the 9th Army under General William Simpson would push out from the Wesel crossing sector and curve southeast. To the south, the 1st Army under General Courtney Hodges would push out from the Remagen bridgehead and curve northeast. If the two pincers met, everything between them and the Rhine would be trapped in a single pocket. The northern crossing had been no small thing in its own right. While the 1st Army had grabbed its bridge by surprise at Remagen, the northern armies had forced the Rhine near Wesel in a massive, deliberate assault, a set-piece operation with airborne landings, thousands of guns, and an amphibious crossing under a curtain of artillery. From that northern bridgehead, Simpson's 9th Army now had the room to swing down and around the top of the Ruhr. Between the 2 American pincers stood Army Group B, and Army Group B was commanded by the hardest defensive mind left in the German army. Walther Model was among the most experienced field commanders Hitler had. He had made his name on the Eastern Front, where in 1942 and 1943 he had held the Argev salient with the German 9th Army against one Soviet offensive after another. That long, grinding defense earned him a second nickname, the Lion of Defense, and it fixed his reputation as the man who could hold a line that others said could not be held. His superiors and his soldiers also called him Hitler's fireman, the officer sent to the worst emergency on the map to put out the fire. He was blunt with Hitler in a way few generals dared to be, and Hitler tolerated it because Model produced results when the situation was desperate. Model also had recent proof of what he could do to an Allied offensive. In September of 1944, when British and American airborne forces dropped deep into the occupied Netherlands to seize a string of bridges and vault across the Rhine from the north, it was Model and his Army Group B that broke the attack apart at Arnhem. The great Allied gamble had failed against his defence. Now, half a year later, the same Field Marshal was defending the ground his industry had built, and this time the fire was closing on both sides of him at once. There was one more thing weighing on Army Group B by the spring of 1945, and it helps explain why the Army Group was so hollow. Only months earlier, in December of 1944, it had been Model's Army Group B that led Germany's last great offensive in the West, the surprise armoured thrust through the Ardennes forest that the Allies came to call the Battle of the Bulge. That offensive had swallowed the last reserves of tanks, fuel and trained men the German army in the West still possessed, and it had failed. By the time the Rhine was crossed at Remagen, the divisions Model commanded were shadows of the formations that had attacked in the snow that winter. They were worn down, under strength, and running on empty fuel tanks. The 5th Panzer Army, once the spearhead of the Ardennes attack, now had far more men on its rolls than it had rounds to give them. The northern pincer moved first, and moved fast. Simpson's 9th Army broke out and drove southeast across open country, its armoured columns covering ground faster than the German command could respond. The German units in front of them were short of fuel, short of ammunition, and short of trained men. Many were second-line formations, replacement units, anti-aircraft crews pressed into ground defence, and older reservists. They could delay the Americans at a river line or the edge of a town, but they could not stop the weight of the advance. The southern pincer came out of the Remagen bridgehead close behind. Hodges pushed the 1st Army east and then swung it north, aiming for the same stretch of country the 9th Army was racing toward. Between the two forces, the open gap narrowed day by day. The German commanders inside the shrinking corridor could see exactly what was forming around them. The only way out ran east, through the closing gap, and every hour that gap grew tighter. Model asked Berlin for permission to pull Army Group B eastward while the corridor was still open. A withdrawal in time would have saved the bulk of his force to fight again on a shorter and more defensible line further into Germany. Berlin refused. Hitler had already declared the Ruhr a fortress, to be held to the last man and the last round. Model was ordered to stand and defend the industrial region rather than save the army inside it. The order stripped him of his last option. His force would now hold ground that was in the process of becoming a cage. On the 1st of April, the two pincers met at Lippstadt. Simpson's men coming down from the north and Hodges's men coming up from the south linked on the road east of the town on Easter Sunday just after midday. The corridor was gone. Behind the link-up, the entire Army Group B was cut off from the rest of the Reich. For the next 3 days the Americans widened and hardened the ring, pushing the walls of the encirclement inward and sealing every seam. By the 4th of April, the encirclement was complete and secure. With the trap firmly shut, the 9th Army passed back from the Northern Command to Bradley's 12th Army Group, so that a single headquarters now controlled both jaws of the pocket. The reduction of the Ruhr became one coordinated operation. What had been caught inside was not a rearguard or a screen. It was an entire army group. Model held the 5th Panzer Army and the 15th Army, 7 corps in all, somewhere between 19 and 21 divisions on paper, among them the 116th Panzer Division. Around that corps stood the men who were never meant to be front-line soldiers, the Volkssturm Home Guard and boys of the Hitler Youth, handed rifles and a stretch of rubble to hold. Inside the ring were about 24 German generals and one admiral, Werner Scheer, who had commanded the Naval Defence District in Essen. All of it was now packed into an oval of ground. The German command began to call Fortress Ruhr. The pocket measured roughly 30 miles across and 75 miles long, an egg-shaped basin of blast furnaces, mine heads, canals, and shattered cities. Essen, Dortmund, Düsseldorf, Hagen, the great industrial towns of the Reich, all sat inside the ring. On a map it looked like a fortress. On the ground it was a trap with no supply. Years of Allied bombing had already gutted much of the region's industry, and what factories still stood could no longer move what they made out to any front. The soldiers inside were surrounded by the greatest concentration of war industry in Europe, and they were slowly running out of bullets and bread. There was also a civilian population still living in the ruins. Millions of people crowded into cellars and half-standing houses across the industrial towns. The fighting now moved through streets where families were sheltering. That fact weighed on Model as heavily as any military calculation. To defend the Ruhr street by street, as his orders demanded, meant fighting through the middle of his own country's cities, with his own country's people still in them. The Americans did not storm the interior. Bradley chose to compress the pocket steadily rather than trade lives for speed. 1st Army and 9th Army divisions pressed inward from every side at once, taking towns, cutting units off from one another, and collecting the German soldiers who chose surrender over a hopeless stand. The pressure was constant, and it came from all directions at the same time, and there was nowhere inside the ring for a defender to fall back to. Each day the oval shrank. Each day more prisoners came in, first in dozens, then in hundreds, then in numbers no one had planned for. The reduction drew in a mass of American strength, more than a dozen divisions closing on the pocket from its rim inward. In many places the fight went out of the defence before the Americans even arrived. Local commanders and town officials, unwilling to see what was left of their cities, fought over house by house, handed their towns over rather than defend them down to the last wall. Elsewhere, German units fought hard for a day or two at a canal line or a factory edge, then folded once they were cut off and out of ammunition. The pattern repeated across the whole basin: a stubborn local stand in one place, a quiet surrender in the next, and everywhere the ring drawing tighter around the industrial towns. Through the first 2 weeks of April, the oval steadily caved in. American armoured columns drove along the valleys of the Ruhr and the Sieg, breaking the German-held ground into smaller and smaller fragments. Radio contact between Model's headquarters and his corps grew patchy, then failed altogether. Orders that did get through were often meaningless by the time they arrived, since the units they were meant for had already been overrun or had already given up. An army group that had been a coherent fighting organisation at the start of the month was, by the middle of it, a scatter of isolated pockets with no fuel to move and no ammunition to fight. On the 14th of April, the pocket was cut in two. First Army and Ninth Army units drove toward each other again, this time from inside the ring, and met on the Ruhr River near Hattingen. The link split Fortress Ruhr into an eastern half and a western half, each now completely isolated from the other. With that split, whatever coordination Model still held over his scattered force broke apart. From that point, the surrender was no longer a question of whether, only of how fast. It came fast. With the pocket torn in half and the German units out of ammunition and out of food, the surrenders turned from a trickle into a flood. Whole divisions laid down their arms rather than fight on for a Reich that was itself only weeks from collapse. Men who had held the line for years walked forward with their hands raised, in numbers that overwhelmed the American units trying to process them. On the 15th and 16th of April, the eastern half of the pocket gave way and surrendered. The western half held 2 days longer. On the 18th of April, the last organised resistance in the pocket ended. Fortress Ruhr had ceased to exist as a fighting formation. As the pocket collapsed, the Americans gave Model a direct way out. General Matthew Ridgway, whose airborne corps was helping crush the pocket from within, sent an officer forward under a white flag with a letter addressed to the Field Marshal. It urged him to surrender the men still under his command and spare them a pointless fight in a cause that was already lost. And it reminded him that a commander's duty, once a battle was decided, was to the lives of his soldiers. Model read it and refused. He sent back word that surrender was impossible for him, pointing to his oath and his honour as a German officer. Ridgway tried a second time, and the second appeal met the same answer. Model would not put his name to the capitulation of an army group under any terms. Refusing Ridgway was only half of Model's problem. At the same time that he would not surrender his army group, he also refused to obey Hitler's standing order to fight to the last man and pull the industrial region and its civilian population down along with his soldiers. He had watched the German 6th Army destroyed at Stalingrad under exactly that kind of order 2 years earlier. An army held in place until it ceased to exist, and he would not repeat it here in the heart of Germany. He was caught between an order he would not carry out and a capitulation he would not sign. He found a third path. Between the 15th and the 17th of April, Model dissolved Army Group B. He discharged the oldest and the youngest of his men outright, sending the Volkssturm reservists and the Hitler Youth Boys home, and he released the rest to surrender on their own terms, unit by unit, as each commander saw fit. He never signed a surrender of the army group. He dismantled it so that there was no longer an army group left to surrender. For the men in the ranks, the result was the same. Hundreds of thousands of them walked into American captivity over the following days. On the roads inside the pocket, the scale of it became visible. Columns of German soldiers stretched for miles, marching west toward the American lines with their weapons stacked and left behind them. American units found themselves guarding prisoners in numbers many times their own strength, detailing a handful of riflemen to escort thousands of men who had no more will and no more means to keep fighting. There were so many that the normal machinery of taking prisoners simply broke down. The Americans directed the endless columns toward the rear and kept moving east, leaving the count for later. The final count went far past anything American intelligence had predicted. Planners had estimated something on the order of 150,000 prisoners inside the pocket. The real number came to about 317,000, more than twice the estimate. It was more men than the German army had lost in the entire Stalingrad disaster, taken in 18 days on the Western Front. At Stalingrad, the encirclement had taken months and had drawn in the strength of an entire Soviet front through the depths of winter. Here the ring had been drawn shut in days by 2 American armies in the last spring of the war. With that surrender, organised German defence of the Rhine and the Ruhr was finished, and the road into central Germany lay open. For what remained of the German leadership, the loss of the Ruhr was the end of any real hope. The arsenal of the Reich was gone, and with it the last army group standing between the Western Allies and the centre of the country. Hitler, by then shut in the bunker beneath Berlin with the Soviets closing on the capital from the east, had lost in the west the one force that might still have slowed the Allied advance. There were no reserves left to send, no fresh divisions to raise, and no industry left to arm them. The war in the West had, in practical terms, already been decided in the fields around the Ruhr. The prisoners were funneled west, back across the river they had failed to hold, into a chain of open enclosures the Americans built along the Rhine's west bank. There were 19 of these camps in all, hastily fenced fields with little shelter, filled far beyond any plan. The Germans called them the Rhine meadow camps, fields ringed with wire and packed edge to edge with the remnant of the army that had held the West, stretching as far as a man could see across the flat ground beside the river. The camps operated from April into the late summer, and in the first weeks the conditions were hard. The men held under open sky with little food until the supply situation improved. It was an army's worth of soldiers sitting in the mud beside the Rhine, and the war was not even over yet. For Model himself, there would be no captivity. On the 20th of April, the propaganda ministry in Berlin broadcast a public denunciation of his men, branding the soldiers of Army Group B a traitor army for laying down their weapons. It was the regime he had served without pause for years, turning on him and his men at the very end. Model also understood clearly what his own capture would mean. The Soviets had already named him in connection with mass deportations and deaths in the occupied East, and for him, trial and imprisonment were certain. The war he had fought for 6 years had come down to a shrinking wood between two rivers, with enemies on every side and no army left to command. On the 21st of April 1945, Model walked into a stretch of forest between Duisburg and the villages to its east, and he ended his own life with his service pistol. He was buried where he fell, in the ground of the industrial region he had been ordered to hold to the last. He had commanded the final German army in the West, and with his death, the German command in the West was gone. The collapse of the Ruhr did not happen in isolation. As the pocket was being reduced, the rest of the German front in the West was coming apart at the same pace. American and British armies drove east across open country against crumbling resistance. On the 25th of April, American and Soviet troops met on the Elbe River at Torgau, cutting what remained of Germany in two. The army that might have defended the centre of the country was sitting in the Rhine meadows behind the lines, taken out of the war in a single stroke in the Ruhr. The bridge at Remagen had opened the door on the 7th of March. The link-up at Lippstadt had shut it on the 1st of April. Between those two dates, an entire German army group was encircled, split in two, and taken prisoner, and the industrial heart that had armed Germany for 6 years passed into Allied hands. 317,000 men marched west into the meadows along the Rhine. The Field Marshal who would not surrender them lay in a forest near the river he had been ordered to defend. Within 3 weeks, the war in Europe was over.